So here we are in 1640, which is really, to me, the height of the Baroque period. And I think for a minute we wanted to talk about how the Baroque is really a lot of things in a way. I mean, it's different in Holland than it is in France, than it is in Italy with Caravaggio, or Rubens in Flanders.
Even within those different regions, there's different styles of Baroque art. I mean, when we talk about the Baroque style, it's not really one style, it's an umbrella term, and so we can think about the kind of earthly realism and drama of Caravaggio in Italy.
Kind of gritty, dirty realism.
Which is quite different from contemporaries in Italy like the Carracci, who helped establish the Baroque style. Their art tends to be more classicizing, more idealizing. Then you have followers of theirs like Guido Reni and Domenichino. Like you said, you have Rubens and Flanders, and there's all kinds of Baroque painting. Poussin, who we're looking at here, he's working, as you said, at the height of the Baroque style, and in a way, his painting is very Baroque because, like other painters of the time, his work is very naturalistic, it's very classicizing, and maybe most importantly, it's very, very clear and organized and legible.
I think that may be the sort of good, overwhelming term to think about it in terms of the church and the sort of mandate to create art during this period that is direct and that is legible and that really reaches its audience. And there are just a number of ways of doing that.
That's right, and we also should relate it to other contextual issues. When we're talking about the 1600s, we have to keep in mind this is the period of the scientific revolution, where you have people like Galileo and others who are emphasizing the idea that knowledge comes from observation, and so it makes sense that in a period like that there would be artists who emphasize naturalism and studying from life. So let's talk about this painting of the landscape with St. John the Evangelist from around 1640. It does represent primarily the landscape, but what's typical for Poussin is that nature could be thought of as potentially represented as something overwhelming and chaotic.
Yeah, he's really organized.
But Poussin's representation is very, very organized. Now, he definitely did go out and study nature firsthand, but he's not representing...
a tree and a hill, and then he'd go back into his studio.
Right, and create an idealized, more organized version of what he had seen.
And fill it with some very classical-looking buildings, which might not have been there in reality.
Exactly. There's nowhere you can go and actually see this scene in Italy. And we should say Italy is where Poussin spent most of his career. He's a French painter working largely for French patrons, but he spends most of his life in Italy, in Rome mostly, in fact dies there.
And so this looks like a sort of Italianate landscape, but it's not a specific view of a place in Italy.
So how does he organize the landscape so well?
Well, what I notice is that the figure is in the center and that our eye is drawn there by the trees on either side that sort of anchor the image and frame the figure. There's those areas of kind of architectural ruins also on either side of the figure. But he also seems to take our eye from the foreground and move it from place to place, providing lots of areas of interest. So in a way, just like our bodies might travel through the landscape, our eye kind of travels through this landscape, through back to the atmospheric perspective in the far background.
What I like to say is that Poussin punctuates his space.
That's a nice way to put
he
it.
punctuates foreground, middle ground, and background very clearly.
And giving us sort of places to rest
That's
at
right.
each point.
And the foreground is marked by a pile of ruins and a bunch of trees. Then the middle ground also marked by a bunch of architecture and some landscape details. And then in the very distant background, again, the mountain and another group of architecture on the shoreline in the distance. And then he not only punctuates front, middle, and back, he also connects the dots. The meandering hillside and path leads us directly from the figure of John the Evangelist straight into the middle. And then that hillside points like an arrow towards the distant background on the far left. And so we not only have a clear sense of depth and space marked out emphatically, he also, as you said, leads our eye through that space. In this case with the hillside and path. In other paintings maybe with a meandering stream or a shoreline.
I mean, in a way I think these kinds of landscapes become a kind of formula for landscape painting for quite some time.
We could also point out he uses things like the repeating diagonal line and the alternating light and shadow to give a sense of
depth.
Rhythm and regularity as well to the painting.
So there's a real keen sense of a landscape that's highly organized and structured.
Very legible. We can see the same kind of approach even in a non-landscape painting. This is an urban scene. This is the rape or kidnapping of the Sabine Women from 1635.
This is a great story.
It's a great story, and this particular painting is at the Metropolitan Museum and is a really interesting representation of the story.
So here the founders of Rome, the male founders of the city of Rome, the ancient Roman Republic, need to marry. They need some women in order to procreate and to populate the city of Rome.
Exactly, and so they go to the Sabines, and there are various versions,
city, right.
various versions of the story. They go to the neighboring city where the Sabines are, and there's a feast or a festival, and at a certain point, the leader of the Romans, here dressed in red, gives a signal, and the Roman men grab the Sabine women and carry them off, as the Sabine fathers and mothers and children cry and
It's
resist.
a terrifying scene.
Right,
Kind of
but
a
again,
story.
in the midst of a scene that's very chaotic and
Yeah.
dramatic, again, we see, typical of Poussin, a very legible, clear, highly organized representation of the scene.
It reminds me of the Caravaggio in terms of the clarity of the gestures of the figures. So
That's
that
right.
you look at the woman in blue on the left, pushing away and reaching up and struggling. The woman just to the right in a very similar position. It's sort of poses that don't look so much exactly like what it would have looked like at this moment,
That's
but
right.
poses that sort of symbolize in a way a kind of struggle.
If we took a snapshot of a real battle taking place, it wouldn't look anything
with women
like
being
this.
raped and carried off.
That's
It
right.
would not look like
This is much more organized. And just like the landscape, he's marked out clearly front, middle, and back with large accumulations, large pieces of architecture. And then also, just like the landscape we saw, he leads your eye in the direction he wants it to go. So we have this line of figures, a kind of frieze of figures right across the front of the picture plane, typical for most of his paintings. And then notice how that on the right curves around and into the background where our eye is led to the large building in the middle.
Yeah.
And then our eye is also drawn to the distant background because that's the only other place left to look. And there's even a figure of a soldier right in the middle of the painting who's pointing.
up to the
And so
cloud in
he
the
makes you
background.
look in that direction.
Yeah, it's intensely organized and sort of and controlled in a way.
Yeah, and a sense of regularity and organization is also
Order.
given by the repeating gestures. Look at that upraised hand. It repeats 3 times across the
At
exact
least.
middle of the painting,
Right.
going back in depth, and then even in the other direction as well. And so this repeating gesture, the sense of movement across the space, and also the very clear punctuation and marking out of the spaces gives a
Right.
very strong organization to
And
the scene.
it's probably useful to say that this kind of painting would have been created by many studies of individual figures at first. Probably the individual figures would have been sketched nude and then clothed, and then there would have been many compositional studies. And so that sense of order and structure is not something that was arrived at spontaneously, but is the result of a long artistic process.
That's right. And one other thing to say, especially as we're looking at this painting, is this is a good example to understand why Poussin is one of the defining artists of what we would call a linear style, in contrast to the painterly style of someone like Rubens. And, as art history was becoming standardized as a field of study, the linear painting of Poussin contrasted with the painterly style of Rubens was one of the most typical ways to discuss a style of the work of art.
So if you looked at this painting at the Met up close, you wouldn't see, you'd be hard pressed to see a brushstroke.
Exactly.
The contours of the figures are closed.
Everything seems in high focus. There's not a lot of gesture and texture on the surface of the painting.
Right.
And so it's typical of Poussin.